This lecture will look at slavery as it is presented in the middle third of Chapter 3 of our textbook. Again, Chapter 3 has a kind of a tripartite, three-part structure, right? Freedom is first, and then slavery, and then economics. Those three things are very much woven together in the chapter, obviously, but also in the time period. There's a reason they put them together, because you can't have one without the other without the other. And in many ways, slavery was the other side of freedom. That it's not an irony. Sometimes we like to know, wasn't it ironic? It wasn't ironic, because the way that freedom was conceptualized, in particular by not the elite, folks who weren't of the most elite class status, that they could think about their freedom in a way that was fundamentally different than the way they would think if they could potentially be on the bottom rung of society, like they may have been in, say, England, right, in the previous generation. So all of these things come together in chapter 3. As a kind of historical side note, as someone who spent time researching this stuff and writing about it in graduate school and beyond, it's interesting that in our textbook it actually goes through, and I don't know if there isn't a work cited in our textbook, but when you look at slavery in the Chesapeake and South Carolina, the way that our textbook talks about it is right out of a book called A Slave Counterpoint by Philip Morgan, in which he looks, a big book, looks at, compares and contrasts slavery in the two colonies. Very influential over scholarship. The next section, African American Community, starting with a book called Roll, Jordan, Roll by Eugene Genovese in the late 1950s. There's a kind of body of scholarship that looks at what we might call agency, and which I'll talk about as agency in slave communities. Judith Carney's Black Rice, which is about enslaved workers on rice plantations in South Carolina. That is in here. Black Majority. There's a lot of scholarly books that are condensed into the book. So, I mean, sometimes I will quibble with some of the wording in our book, or I'll push back against some of the things, but really it condenses a lot of very important scholarship. And I really enjoyed reading this chapter for that reason. Okay, so let's get into it. A little bit of review. Remember, slavery isn't new. No one said slavery was new. It's been around for a very long time. What is new is the idea of slavery as race-based and heritable, right? So that one particular quote-unquote race, remember, the concept is just being invented in this time period, largely to justify the enslavement of a particular group of people and to justify a racial hierarchy. That is race-based. And then heritable is that you inherit your status. That's not true. In previous eras of slavery, your children could be free, and things like that. So enslaved Africans are seen as a substitute to indentured English because the indentured English are causing too much trouble. In particular, in Virginia, is one of the focuses here. As it turns out, right, wanting freedom is not just something the English have a knack for. Enslaved Africans sue for their freedom. They save money and they manumit or pay off, right, buy their own freedom. So that is a kind of shock. So what we see is a series of anti-black, pro-slavery laws, starting in Barbados in 1661, the Barbados Slave Code. Very, very violent. A very, very harsh, punitive measures, right? So almost like torture, some of these things, right, that are in the black codes, the slave codes. This is a first, right, for race-based slavery. Basically, it exported whole cloth, as it were, to South Carolina, because South Carolina it's like Barbados on the mainland. Barbados is a small island. People start to move off. White people, they bring in slave laborers with them. They bring the laws with them. Partus sequitur ventrum, a fancy way for saying you inherit your status from your mother, which is not the way it is in English common law. English common law, you inherit your status from your father. Of course, in a region and time place where sexual violence against black or enslaved women is commonplace, you can't have a black child or half black child inheriting your property. They changed the laws. That's implemented in Virginia. Virginia begins to shift fully to a chattel slavery model after Bacon's Rebellion. Again, the idea here with after Bacon's Rebellion is you have got poor white and poor black together. There's too many of them. Create slave-based laws and race-based slavery. Chattel slavery, which again, this is a term that we'll see a lot of in scholarship. Chattel means property. So like a cow is your chattel, or like your wagon is your chattel. So in old census and tax records from this time period, you'll see, you know, a list of chattel. That's stuff that like property that you own on a farm. So when we say chattel slavery, we mean slavery in which the people are property, right? So it's different, again, different from previous forms of property. That person, that human being is property, right? Your property that you can do with whatever you feel. The statistics here are bleak. In the background is this famous Thomas Clarkson image of a slave ship from 1822, so later than the period we're looking at when the slave trade is pretty fully developed. And even on the out, this is a illustration that was actually made to support abolitionist aims, right? To visualize, right? Literally visualize, to illustrate the inhumanity of the Middle Passage. 17th century, about 1,000 abducted Africans per year. 18th century, it's up to about 5.5 million transported to the Americas total. By 1860, it's 11 million that end up in the Americas, right? So before 1830 or 1831, this is more people than Europeans, right? More Africans than Europeans are coming to the Americas. Many of them are dying very, very quickly. About 33% die in the seasoning camps in the Caribbean. This is where enslaved Africans are beaten, introduced to very, very physical, difficult labor. They get diseases, and those that survived were called seasoned workers. As a note for when we're talking about the mainland colonies like South Carolina, Virginia, the enslaved laborers on the mainland are increasingly, as we get into the 19th century, certainly, are native born. They're born in the Americas. If they are foreign to the mainland colonies, they're from the Caribbean. They're not directly from Africa, right? That they have a stopover in the Caribbean for this seasoning, and therefore they are more expensive. So an enslaved laborer that has gone through the seasoning process, they're less likely to die, and therefore they are far more expensive. And those are the kind of enslaved laborers that were the focus of people in the Carolinas, Virginia, and elsewhere. So there's a distinction between Caribbean slavery, which has a very high death rate, and slavery in the Americas, which actually has a somewhat lower death rate, and the relationship between enslaver and their property is a little different. They take a little bit more, they pay a little bit more attention to not harming them, because they're actually worth, right, a lot of money. Unknown number. We don't know how many people died in West Africa, right, fighting back against this slave trade. If you survive it, you're a slave for life. So that's certainly better than being dead, I imagine. But for many in the boats, it wasn't, right? Many people in boats committed suicide, things like that. The destabilization of the region lasts for generations and generations, and it really sets up the next phase of European contact with Africa, which is the wholesale colonization of the continent of Africa. West Africa is very easily colonized because its social structures, its culture, its traditional alliances are all torn asunder, right? Okay. Let's look specifically at the 17th and 18th centuries. A couple things about language here. Fun fact, plantations are labor camps. That is an accurate description of a plantation, right? It is a labor camp. It's a place where workers are forced to labor and they cannot escape. It is a labor camp. It's something we associate with different time periods of world history, the idea of a labor camp. Stalinist Russia, or Mao in China, or Hitler in Nazi Germany. But that's what plantations are. A master is an enslaver, right? Or a planter is an enslaver. The mistress is the wife, the female enslaver. A servant is a slave. This kind of genteel language is something that emerges in American history textbooks, really from the 1870s on, to kind of whitewash the violence of slavery. This is erasing history, right? There's a lot of debate in 2020 about, what erasing history. This is erasing history, right? Using language that makes it seem, when you think plantation, it seems like, you can kind of picture it being, the big veranda and just plugging in my computer here, the big veranda and the, people sitting around drinking tea or something. No, I mean, these are labor camps. These are places where people are forced to work and die. So that kind of language is very important. Another couple notes on language here while we're at it. These laborers are not African Americans, right? So even if you're born in, say, Virginia, you're not an African American. An African American suggests that you are a citizen, right? In order to be an African American or Chinese American or Irish American or whatever, you need to have that American piece, right? You need to have citizenship in the country. So these people are not African Americans, right? Many of them are enslaved Africans, if they're born in Africa, or enslaved laborers. They are black. There's any number of terms we can use, but African American is not accurate. It's just not until we get to the 14th Amendment can we actually say that one is an African American, right? Also, the term, this is something I saw a little bit of in some writing. We're going to read things that have the word Negro in it. That is not something that we necessarily will repeat because it's antiquated. It's not an accurate term. It's not even so much as it is so super offensive like the N-word or something, but it is just kind of something that is not accurate. It's from a bygone era. So if you're quoting a document, that's fine, right, to quote it. But generally in our own writing and in our speech, we can just say, right, enslaved laborers, enslaved Africans, enslaved black laborers, what have it. There's a historical point about the transition from Negro to black, and we could talk about that in class. It happens in the mid to late 1960s, so pretty recently. But we needn't get into it now in this lecture. We can talk about it in class. In the time period we're looking at, there are two centers of enslaved labor. One is the Chesapeake, and this is what your book gets at. Again, following from Philip Morgan's slave counterpoint, which looks at these two regions. One is the Chesapeake, that is Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, primarily Virginia. This is tobacco plantations. It is the task system. So it is a kind of enslaved labor where laborers are given tasks to do. You go out and you perform those tasks. There's a lot of downtime because of the nature of tobacco farming, right? It's the fields are fallow during the winter. There's stuff you have to do in the winter, but it's not directly associated with tobacco. So that's a task system. It is not as brutal as what's happening in the Caribbean with, say, sugarcane, which is almost 24 hours a day. You can work almost 12 hours or 12 months a year. There are more escapes. Obviously, it's closer to the north. The other major region is South Carolina. This is rice growing, and this is the gang system. This is, again, gangs of laborers out in the fields with an overseer making them work. There is less of a chance of escape. It's further away, right, from the north. However, because it's such a large population of enslaved people, it's because of so many are directly from the Caribbean or through the Caribbean, from Africa via the Caribbean, they forge a very unique culture, unique language, unique customs, because it's such a strong and isolated community of enslaved workers, as opposed to Virginia, where there's much more fluidity between enslaved black laborers and free blacks or white people. Again, I'll give props where need be in our book, but I'll also critique it where need be. South Carolina planters hit upon rice cultivation. Aha, they hit upon that. Page 77. That is not true. Rice cultivation, they initially thought they were going to grow indigo and sugar in South Carolina, like they had been doing in Barbados. It is enslaved Africans who start growing rice for their own, to supplement their own diets. And then they realize, white enslavers realize that this is a very profitable commodity crop, and they start encouraging enslaved Africans to clear swamp areas, put down, the kind of rice paddies, the kind of dam structures and irrigation structures that you need for rice. So it really is a black contribution to American agriculture or the diet. Interestingly, in the 1880s, 1890s, you can see all of these advertisements, South Carolina rice, and it's very kind of Orientalist, where it's all about China and East Asia, and that's where it's the influence. But that's total, again, an erasure of the actual history. It's actually West African. West Africans had been eating rice for centuries in West Africa. The Deep South, so we have a tendency when we go into talking about slavery, our mind goes right to cotton. Right, cotton plantations, gang labor systems, the guy on white guy on the horseback with the whip. That is the Deep South. That is Mississippi, Alabama, right? That is a kind of agriculture that doesn't exist. That's not even a region that exists, right? So we don't even get into the idea of settling those, what are now those states of Alabama, Mississippi, parts of Georgia. We don't even get there until the 1830s. So we are way, way far away from either cotton as a major commodity crop or the Deep South, right? Along the Mississippi and things like that. Little exception with New Orleans, but we won't get into it. Black resistance before white assistance. I want to emphasize this point because this is something that, again, in terms of a misperception of history, there's this notion that, William Wilberforce in the 1700s or Abraham Lincoln in the 1800s comes down like a white savior from the heavens and, emancipates everyone, ends the slave trade, what have you. That's not accurate, right? That from the very beginning of the slave trade, you have black resistance. Again, before white assistance. You have slave ship mutinies. We know at least around 500 known mutinies. Some of them were successful, others not. Suicide on board, suicide in the New World. Work slowdowns and stoppages were very, very common. Enslaved laborers deciding as a group to slow down the work process, to protest, or just to stop and refuse to work, to making a demand of some sort. Poisoning people was also common, whether it's from traditional medicines that were brought over from West Africa and planted in the Caribbean or in, say, South Carolina, or indigenous Native American plants that enslaved laborers learned about to use to either sometimes heal people, but also to potentially make someone sick and even kill someone. Slave insurrections are the most famous. In the background here, this image is an image of the Nat Turner insurrection in the 1830s in Virginia. The Haitian Revolution, of course, the most famous, the most successful slave insurrection in history. Enslaved people rise up and create a new independent black nation. And they actually, in their constitution, say that anyone who is black anywhere in the world can come to Haiti and be a citizen, whether it's enslaved people in the Caribbean or North America, people from Africa. It is a grand vision inspired by both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. It happens about at the same time as the French Revolution. But France does not trade with them, does not allow the United States, England, or Spain to trade with them, and puts them under a great deal of debt, which we can talk about again later, the debt indemnity. But these are slave insurrections. They happen all the time. Your book talks about the Stono Rebellion, super, super common. And then people running away, forming what were known as maroon communities. This is very common in the Caribbean, Haiti in particular, but also in North America. Enslaved laborers run away and integrate into Native American groups, marry into and become parts of them, and blend. And then freedom suits, right? People suing for their freedom, and that happens from the 18th century on. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the American Revolution. Meanwhile, right, the white assistance, this comes late, right? Quakers outlaw slavery during the American Revolution, I think 1876. The British abolitionist movement begins in the in the 1790s into the 1820s and 30s. Some colonials oppose slavery, others don't. It's considered pretty radical if you're white and you support abolition. It's considered pretty radical. And even most abolitionists are like, let's ship enslaved laborers back to Africa. So again, white abolitionists do not end slavery, right? Enslaved people from the very first instance of conflict and capture in West Africa to the slave ships, to the seasoning camps, through the Caribbean, into North America, through suicide, slave insurrections, poisoning, work slowdowns. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. That is the thing that had the drive to end slavery, not just Abraham Lincoln, right, and the Emancipation Proclamation, which actually didn't free really anyone. More on that later. Okay, a couple more slides here. Agency, this is an important thing. And something to be careful. It's not like we can't toggle back and forth between poles of either slavery is the most brutal institution imaginable, right? It's a genocide that lasts for centuries. The human toll is really unfathomable. Yes, that's all true. So then to say that there's this idea of agency, or within the institution of slavery, workers finding spaces for freedom and community, it's not as though oh, well, then it was fine, right? We can't, sometimes there's this tendency to well, if you invented the blues and had, celebrations for West African holidays, then it couldn't have been that bad. Absolutely not, right? I mean, we have survivor testimonies from the Holocaust of survivors talking about the things that they did in the camps to try to stay human, right? To try to create some sense of community or maintain your sanity. So agency is that within a limited and restricted scope of what freedom can mean, because you are enslaved, you are not free. What are the things that happen to create community? This image in the background is really great. For a long time, it's from 1785, really, really old, and it's called The Old Plantation. They eventually found out who painted it. It was in South Carolina enslaver by the name of John Rose. It is very interesting because it is exceptional in its depiction of enslaved Africans, not in the service of white people, not as the background, not as some fanciful depiction of their lives, but a, kind of outsider art, a untrained artist's perspective on enslaved people doing something for themselves, among themselves. So this painting, The Old Plantation, is very, very interesting, and it's often used in depictions of slave agency. They do try to recreate West African traditions. Very interestingly, a very large percentage of enslaved Africans are Muslims. This is a region that had been Muslim since, right, the 14th century, right? You think to Mansa Musa or what have you, right? This is a very similar region. And that's important because it influences a lot of the traditions of enslaved Africans in the Americas. Music, cooking, language, they all adopt and adapt to, right, their new environment. They build new traditions as well. Just some examples in the background of this painting. You see someone playing what looks to be a banjo. Again, this is the first depiction we have of a banjo. It's actually a West African instrument that's made out of a gourd. The blues tradition, famously associated with West Africa, and even some of the kind of vocal inflections of the blues, historians of music have said are actually reminiscent of calls to prayer, right? So Muslim calls to prayer, that because increasingly enslaved Africans couldn't show, right, they had to convert to Christianity, they couldn't be Muslim anymore, that they found ways to continue on these traditions, and blues music was one of them, right? They could recreate a call to prayer through a kind of thing that wasn't, right, religious. Rice cultivation, as I mentioned. Peanuts are native to West Africa. Sesame is native to West Africa. The tradition of frying foods is native to West Africa. All of these things are brought over with enslaved Africans and really influence certainly American culture. I mean, all of these things, right? The blues, banjo, bluegrass, frying foods. There's, especially in the South, all kinds of traditional Southern food that is directly linked to African customs. Okra is another one. Okay, again, we've seen these graphics. It's a lot of people. I want to end with, again, speaking of erasing history, a few images from American history textbooks. On the right, one from the 1950s, and then on the top, more recent, right? So this is, right, saying that slavery wasn't that bad, and that the masters were very nice. This is a worksheet from a school that has it's called what? Life of a Slave, a balanced view. Got to have some balance, right? So some bad things, but surely there were some good things about slavery. That kind of, right, that it's a false equivalence, right? It's a kind of dichotomy that actually erases the actual violence of slavery. And as you see here, God bless them, the student putting, not applicable under the benefits column. And then again, this was famous a few years ago from a Texas public school history book. Atlantic slave trade between 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States. Just workers, just doing work, just workers. Again, this is a reason why people have, like the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, did a school survey recently, and they found that only 1/3 of respondents knew that the 13th Amendment ended slavery. You might not know this yet, but this is people who have taken U.S. history already. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. It's like super famous. Less than half knew about the Middle Passage, right? This whole, that thick, right, arrow from here to there, right? Because they go from here. First leg of the passage is from Europe to Africa, the Middle Passage, and then back. Triangular trade. And then only about 8% answered that slavery was the primary reason for the South seceding from the Union. It was. You feel there's a lot of hullabaloo about states' rights, but it's a state's rights to have slaves. Period. Full stop. The Civil War was about slavery. And that's just the history. Half of the respondents say that it was to protest taxes on imported goods. Just not even relevant. So again, we have, as a discipline, the discipline of history at the K through 12 level has not wanted to have those difficult conversations. And what that does is indeed erase history. It's an erasure of history that we need to, in our generation of teachers and students, push back against and have a more accurate depiction of a brutal institution that we need to confront head on, right? We need to confront the historical realities and the legacies of that institution that sadly live on into our current moment. Next time, part 3 of the chapter, economics. Actually, I apologize. This lecture, but the recording of this lecture was delayed because I couldn't, in my collection of memes, I could not find this excellent meme, which I did not author. But you're probably scratching your head. But if you're a fan of mercantile economics and David Ricardo, boy, oh boy, do you think this one is funny. So next time we will talk about economics and mercantilism in the colonial world. Thank you.